Hello and welcome to India's World. Sri Lanka has slipped into a debt trap, and along with that has come a growing Chinese stranglehold over strategic assets in that country. The total debt of Sri Lanka is about $70 billion, and over $8 billion of this is owned by China. The country's debt to GDP ratio currently stands around 75%. Slightly over 95% of all government revenue is at present going towards debt repayment, and more than one-third of it is used to service Chinese debt. Much of Sri Lanka's debt came about when the last government of President Mahinda Rajapaksa initiated several large-scale and extremely expensive infrastructure projects with Chinese loans. This has resulted in Sri Lanka being pushed to the brink of bankruptcy, prompting an IMF bailout. After criticizing the increasing role of China under the Rajapaksa government, the Sri Sena government, which assumed charge in early 2015, has taken a U-turn. It has now gone for a debt-for-equity swap with China, lending a greater permanence to Chinese presence in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has now reversed the suspension of the controversial Chinese-controlled Colombo Port City project. The area given to China for the city on a 99-year lease has also been increased, and the Chinese companies involved have been offered lucrative tax breaks. China has also been given 80% ownership of the Hambantota port in the south. The Matala airport at Hambantota has also been given to a Chinese firm to manage and operate, and a 15,000-acre Chinese-led industrial zone nearby has been revived. The relationship between Sri Lanka and China has been upgraded to what is called an all-weather partnership. What do these developments mean for Sri Lanka, and what impact might they have on India? To discuss this, we have with us a very distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Hardeep Puri, a distinguished diplomat. He's been India's ambassador to Brazil and has served in Sri Lanka. He was also India's permanent representative to the United Nations, both in Geneva and New York. We have with us Ambassador G. Parthasarthy, another distinguished diplomat. He served as India's ambassador to Myanmar, High Commissioner of India to Australia, Pakistan and Cyprus. He follows Sri Lanka quite closely. And we have with us Mr. Mohan Guruswamy. He heads the Center for Policy Alternatives, a New Delhi-based independent think tank. He's author of several books and is well-known commentator on strategic issues in the Indian media. I welcome you gentlemen to this discussion. Mohan, let me begin with you. How serious is the debt trap that Sri Lanka finds itself in? Do you think that a situation has come where Sri Lanka might not be able to service this debt?
Well, when economists say that if you're reaching 100% of GDP as a government debt, then you're in trouble because you'll have problems servicing that debt. Sri Lanka is at about 89% now, and it's heading close to 100, just like the United States. As you know, the picture is not very different. But the United States prints its own money, so it can give you back the money you all want, which has just run off a press. But Sri Lanka can't do that. It has to earn the money to give it back to you. Out of that debt, there are different interest rates. A lot of that debt, foreign debt, which is about 35 billion, is quite serviceable because the interest rates are quite low. There's an IDA line, there's a World Bank line. But there's this Chinese debt about 8 billion, which is high cost debt, which is going at about, it's very opaque, but it's somewhere between 8 to 9%. And the Chinese has started putting pressure on getting that money back, or in exchange for deferment, not cancelling. They're asking for more concessions. Now, I personally, looking at it from a strategic angle, I don't see China as Hambantota or any other place in Sri Lanka as being much of a strategic hedge against India.
We will discuss the strategic issues in a bit.
But there are the commercial implications, and we must ask ourselves this question: if Sri Lanka benefits by that commercial investment and by having a economic transformation of certain areas, why should we worry? Because the Sri Lankans will benefit by it, and they are our neighbors, and they are almost our kin. Yeah. So they will benefit by it. So, but I don't think it's sustainable for Sri Lanka because this deal which the Chinese have done is very one-sided. I think Sri Lanka should press for a complete renegotiation of that, saying that, look, you've taken out all the money they've invested in reality by supplying the raw material.
Let me take this question to Ambassador Parthasarthy, that Mohan says that they should completely renegotiate it. But the total debt from China is only $8 billion. So I'm saying, is China really the main culprit responsible for the situation that Sri Lanka finds itself in? Because 8 billion out of 70 billion isn't very much.
Well, if you take what has been invested in Hambantota, what is coming in, what has been invested in the container terminal, what is going to come in this port city project, it's going to be very substantial. So you have to look at the future. What is more worrisome to me is being unable to service its debt on Hambantota. They are actually almost handing an entire strategically located port and a supporting airfield to the Chinese right on our shores. And the Chinese are quite blatant. When Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi was there, you had a Chinese submarine twice landing up around there. So I think the Chinese, this should not be looked purely in economic terms. They will use the debt to convert it into equity or whatever. They will use it to take much more direct control.
They've already used it.
Yes, and they will establish much more direct control. And the Sri Lankans seem to be rushing back. And that is a matter of concern. I would not ignore it.
Okay, we'll leave the strategic issues aside because we're going to discuss them in a bit. Let's discuss the debt. How is it, Hardeep, that without building any new infrastructure project, under President Maithripala Sirisena and Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe in the last 2 years, domestic debt grew by 12% and foreign debt by 25%.
No, this is a question you should ask them when you take decisions which are not based on economic reality. I mean, let's separate the two. Insofar as China is concerned, of all the projects you mentioned, the only one to my knowledge which is really doing well is that container terminal. That Matala airport is $300–400 million of loan, and Sri Lankans are spending $100–120 million a year to maintain the facility, and it's non-viable. Hambantota, where we are talking about 80% equity being taken by that Chinese firm, I mean, anyone looking at that project will tell you it's not viable, it's not commercially viable.
Then why have the Chinese taken 80% equity?
Well, you know, that raises a number of other questions. If you make those kinds of investments, I mean, let us presume that the decision making is sound, which is not always the case in many such projects. Yeah. There is always a mix between the political, strategic, the time intervention. Whom do you have which other countries do you have in your consideration basket? But there is no way Hambantota can result in returns in that way. Now, it's a very massive, I think, 15,000 acres. Now, there is a refinery there is a gas waste project. I think there will come a time, before too long, when people will have to sit back and redo the sums. Now, whether that results in renegotiation or it results in other situation. You know, Mohan made a very valid point about the US also having about $19 trillion, you mentioned, equivalent to a year's GDP. But you know, the United States and China, leave the Chinese out, that's the second largest GDP. United States and Sri Lanka are very different entities.
That's what he said.
One is exactly the print, but more than that, look at the resources in that economy, what all they're capable of doing. Sri Lanka could find itself in deeper troubles on a variety of fronts.
Okay, we'll discuss them in a bit, but we need to take a break at this point. Stay with us, don't go away. Welcome back. We are discussing Sri Lanka getting into a debt trap and its implications for Sri Lanka and some of its neighbors. Mohan, is Sri Lanka strategically important for China at all? Or do you think, they just made these investments because, they just do bad business?
No.
Or is it important in their strategy of one belt, one road, of trying to create trading hubs, investment zones, ports in the area? Because it's part of a long-term economic and strategic foresight that they have.
We credit the Chinese with lots of foresight and hindsight and all that stuff. Not necessarily true. Suppose you are sitting with $3.9 trillion as sitting in American banks, and its money is, Americans are depreciating at 4 to 5% a year, the dollar, and then you're getting 0 to 1% as interest. Sometimes you have to pay a service cost, and you're sitting here, you're seeing your money becoming ash in front of you. So the Chinese are being very clever. If you take that money back to China, you'll have hyperinflation. So they're putting it here and there, and they're extracting returns from it. For instance, this Hambantota project, they recovered almost 90% of it in supply of raw material to it. So, they pump prime their own industries like cement, steel, which have excess capacity. So, they've given them business. So, it's a different kind of,
All right. Do you agree with him that
I absolutely agree with him. Not only do they their aid to Sri Lanka and elsewhere across the world have much higher rates of interest than Western aid.
6 percentage points higher than the LIBOR, the London Interbank offer rate?
Now, apart from that, the labor is entirely Chinese. For a minimum of 40% of the machinery has to be Chinese. So, as Mohan says, China is pump priming its own economy. But more importantly, it has now got global ambitions to control the communications routes across Eurasia.
Okay.
That is the Chinese aim.
But Hardeep, do you think the Chinese knew when they made these loans, because only 2% was a grant in aid, 98% was commercial debt. Do you think the Chinese were aware that Sri Lanka would not be able to repay this debt, and they would eventually then get a foothold and ownership of these strategic assets in Sri Lanka?
I'm very worried about this excitement on strategic assets. This same facility, we were sounded about this many years ago. And I remember when I was still a serving secretary in the ministry, we had worked out, I think then, that the cost of the project would be about $600–800 million. And clearly, clear-headed thinking then was, this is not worth our while. I mean, also,
this is Hambantota, not the Colombo Port City was never offered to us.
The one which is at 1.2 billion now.
Not only one worth our while, is also not worth their while.
Yeah, no, but that's how you come to a conclusion. I mean, that if $600–700 million have to be put into it or equivalent, and then you are neither able to, safeguard your investment, nor you are able to do anything for the other party. Let's go back in time. When you look at the India-Sri Lanka agreement, 1987, there was all this talk about the Trincomalee oil tank farms and servicing them. They got a strategic asset. And I remember, Partha will remember that, it was considered to be very sensitive, so it was covered, I think, in a side letter. I mean, many of us then said that these World War II tanks are just not serviceable. You think you're getting a strategic asset, you may end up with a...
Okay, fine. I take the point. Then if this is the case, if this was such clear thinking existed in New Delhi, why was New Delhi upset with the Rajapaksa getting close to China? Was it just the submarines visiting? Was it the Colombo Port City project? Was it this economic project there, the city?
Larger Chinese aim of containing India. They go into Lumbini in Nepal. They are providing nuclear weapons and now submarines to nuclear weapons designs, plutonium weapon, tactical nuclear weapons designs, 8 new submarines to Pakistan. They're not doing it for charity. There is a very clear policy of strategic containment of India. Okay, they don't want.
But we don't have a counter strategy because we are so clever and clear-headed that we say we will not put any money in there.
The fact of the matter is, it would be foolish for us to try and match the Chinese for resources. We have to devise other means of, and including allying with countries who are willing to offer aid at better terms, Japan, OECD and so on, so that there is a balance in Nepal, in Sri Lanka. No single country controls economically Sri Lanka or any other neighbor.
Okay, Mohan, let me ask you this. Do you think India had hoped that when the new government comes, it will distance itself from China? And if it wanted it to do that, have those hopes been belied? Because the new government has taken a U-turn on all Chinese projects and given them a permanent sort of status there. Whether it is strategically important or not important is for you people to tell me.
I think the new government is doing the logical thing. It's stuck with debt. It either tries to service it, either tries to renegotiate it, or to see how it can handle the debt. If it is subscribing to international obligations, it's supposed to pay back that debt because it's signed. You can't say regime specific. So they're trying their best. I think they're trying to wriggle their way out, and we should see how we can help them in doing that. Rather than seeing that as in terms of they're going back to China and all that. And this is the game small countries in the periphery will play all the time, try to make us, and we fall for that bait. So Sri Lanka giving assets away to China, but in reality, even if they control Matala airport, what are they going to do? Are they going to base warplanes there? And will we keep quiet? And how far is Matala from Trincomalee, where we got a Sukhoi base? We'll hardly 18 minutes away. And will it last?
Okay, then let me ask you this. Why have we let things come to such a pass where we are saying, if they do this, then we can do this, that we have counters ready?
This is the basic problem with us. We should never get into ifs and buts. To me, a clear strategy is, we don't have the resources to be a sole funder. Let us work it with other friendly countries so that none of our neighbors becomes exclusively dependent or overly dependent on China.
Do you agree with it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have to be, we have to engage both the donor and the recipient bilaterally. Yeah. And we also then have to work out viable alternate combinations. And I think that's the only way around. But I am not willing, and this I'm going to conclude with that, to get alarmed by these things. Because when you are dealing with non-viable projects, that's a classic debt trap. He can't get out of it immediately. So as Mohan says, help them extract or find a soft, easy way out.
Okay, all right. We need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back in a bit. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are discussing Sri Lanka finding itself in a debt trap and its implications. Partha, we say that we don't have the money to throw away on unviable projects or unviable things. Now, the Chinese have got 80% ownership of this Hambantota port for $1 billion or thereabouts. But around the same time, the Indian Prime Minister goes to Mongolia and gives a grant of $1 billion. So is Mongolia strategically more important for us than Sri Lanka?
Well, I wouldn't get into this stage of comparing Mongolia and Sri Lanka. It's like...
No, I'm comparing the $1 billion and what it can fetch.
Comparing apples with oranges, that's futile. The fact of the matter is, as I go back to what I said, I will not... China's strategy is very clear. Overall dominance of Asia. You talk to the Japanese or you talk to us, both of us share this view, that this is their policy. And we should deal with it in the least confrontational, but also the most effective manner. And therefore, to my view of thinking, we are much easier in working with partners, whether it is the West, whether it is the Japanese, whether it is the Koreans, than the Chinese. That is our USP. We have to use that and have a suitable balance in our neighborhood. You can't stop the Chinese from coming in. I mean, the other point I want to make is what I have seen of our projects.
They're not doing that well.
Project, no, some of it, the project implementation is very bad. Kaladan corridor in Myanmar, some of our projects in Nepal. I think we have to look
back. The housing in Sri Lanka is doing very well.
Housing, as I said some. We need to go much better on project implementation. But come back to the basics. Let us be very, very clear. Chinese attempts to dominate Asia as a part of its larger strategy of being a co-equal and then better than America. This is a fact we'll have to live out, and they are not very friendly. If they were a friendly country, they wouldn't be following Gwadar with the supply of 8 attack submarines to Pakistan.
Okay. Let me just talk about Hambantota for a bit, because you said you were in the government at that time. Now, this Hambantota is located 1,300 kilometers from India's 2 strategic naval bases in Bay of Bengal, Visakhapatnam and Andaman and Nicobar. And he says the Sukhoi base is also there. 500 kilometers south of Sriharikota, which is our military and civilian space port for launching, etc. Now, even if Hambantota is not commercially viable, why is it strategically not important? Because if Chinese are based there, they can keep a much closer watch on Indian activities at Sriharikota.
Who is taking the position that it's strategically not important? I think it's strategically very important. Okay. But
Mohan is taking the position that it's strategically not important.
Mohan has a more relaxed attitude, but let me just give you my perception. Yes, it is strategically important. But when something is strategically important, doesn't mean that you are going to put in $700–800 million. We've already got $1 billion of cumulative investment into investment in Sri Lanka since about 2000 or so. Now, in many other places which you name, there may be lines of credit. Like with Africa, when we put in the $1 billion, $2 billion, those are lines of credit. That's a different way. But here, the Chinese company would take 80% of the equity, all right, in $1.2 billion. I don't think we have those kinds of resources. So, absent those resources, then you have to, and take the strategic importance for given, you have to find other ways of doing this.
Okay, Mohan?
No, what happens here actually is that it's a Sri Lankan company which is going to develop the port, gets Chinese credit for it. It's a borrowing. So what the Chinese are now doing is that against Sri Lankan held equity, they're swapping debt for some equity. It not necessarily mean they'll be given controlling interest out there. We'll have to see how that pans out. And we should also draw red lines. If you're going to use this for, docking a nuclear submarine, that's a red line. We should declare it very clearly. The previous president was playing this game of trying to play us off with the Chinese and saying that if you don't help me, we gave some helicopters and some artillery pieces as gifts the first stage of this war. Then he wanted more. And he said, if you don't give it, I'll go and buy it somewhere else. So, then he has to pay for it. So, we can't fall into this trap all the time. These small countries around keep playing this.
Sri Lankans have done this all the time. There was a time because of the Tamil militancy issue, we had reservations in supplying, making some supplies available. They went to the Pakistanis, etc. Now the Sri Lankans are smart. They will play that game. But we must also be able to engage them in a way where they know what the red lines are. Okay. There's no point drawing red lines and then having them ignore them.
So, Partha, we don't have the financial muscle to back our diplomacy. This we know, and therefore we devise certain other strategies.
Yes.
This our neighbors also know. So, do they, as he says, saying, do they play on this? Not only with China, but with other countries, knowing fully well that India has no economic backbone to bolster its diplomacy.
I don't want to go into the names of leaders. Whether it is Nepal, Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, the Chinese consciously cultivate leaders who are anti-Indian.
No, my question was lack of economic muscle power. Is it a weakness or is it a strength? Because
it's relative. We also put in billions of dollars in
it's relative. But the important point is they combine their economy with this conscious strategy of, as I said, I don't want to name them, but in our neighboring countries, cultivating political parties and leaders who are intrinsically anti-Indian. And I've gone into this in some depth. That is the source of concern. It is all a part of a larger strategic ambition that they will be the unchallenged #1 power in Asia. And that neither India nor Japan nor many others will accept.
And therefore, what are we doing? Mohan,
what should we do? If you don't have money in your pocket to throw around, then you use other kinds of pressures to influence events out there. For instance, the Chinese offered us also money. Now, this government looked at it and said, on these terms, we can't take this money. There's a $30 billion offer pending. We just don't want it because it's the same kind of Sri Lankan CPEC deal. He'll bilk us. So, like the Japanese deal is coming, but that's at 1% credit. You can't get anything better than that. And, and most of the procurement, we've got details written, it comes to our benefit. So, it's very different. So, these are some of the areas where you should try to help these guys saying that, look, this is how you should be looking at projects. If they are wanting to build a road, ask them to set up a cement plant here. Yeah. If they're wanting to build a port, ask them to put a steel plant here. So, that's how we move these things along.
Okay. Now, let me ask you, in fact, all of you. Now, India, diplomacy is clever, no doubt. So, when SAARC didn't happen, we said we'll have BIMSTEC outreach at the BRICS summit. Keep Pakistan and China out. Now, did that really work? Because this equity debt for equity swap has taken place immediately after the BIMSTEC outreach. So there are a lot of people who are saying that this BIMSTEC outreach was much of a muchness. It did not result in anything and will not result in anything. You will not be able to keep China out and you will not be able to isolate Pakistan. And Sri Lanka, what Sri Lanka has done is a prime example of that.
I'm not sure you can establish a direct correlation. What happens is that you've got a regional grouping, sub-regional grouping, and then either more sub-regional. Now, if you find that all your efforts, all the projects are held to hostage by one party, then there is a natural tendency to look at other combinations where some of these schemes, connectivity for instance, can be worked out. Now, that doesn't mean that you're getting an assurance that the other people in the plurilateral or in the sub-regional grouping are going to be, you have an exclusive right in terms of determining where they will go and play these. This is a very complex sort of a process.
Really run out of time. I'd like to thank all of you, Mohan, Guruswamy, Ambassador G. Parthasarthy, Ambassador Hardeep, Puri, for participating in this discussion. That is all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week as usual. Until then, goodbye, and thanks for joining us on India's World.